They called the black CEO servant, unaware she speaks Chinese. Then, she cancels $800M deal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. The room smelled like polished wood and quiet power. Dark red panels lined the walls, lacquered so smooth they reflected the chandelier light above the long conference table. Porcelain cups sat untouched beside leather folders stamped with gold seals. This wasn't a room where people raised their voices. This was a room where fortunes shifted with a nod. She stood at the far end of the table, a black woman in a tailored navy suit. No jewelry loud enough to announce wealth, no assistant hovering behind her, arms crossed, spine straight, expression unreadable. To them, she looked out of place. Two Chinese executives leaned toward each other, shoulders angled away from her, voices lowered just enough to feel safe. One of them, mid-40s, silver watch, the practiced smile of someone who had never been challenged in this room, let out a quiet laugh. He spoke in Mandarin. Not fast, not rushed, comfortable, the kind of tone people use when they believe no one else is listening. She's probably just a servant, he said, eyes flicking toward her suit, then away. A stupid black one. She won't understand a word. The other man smiled wider, older, higher rank. He didn't correct him. He didn't stop him. He approved with silence. A ripple of amusement moved down their side of the table, small, contained, polite, the kind that never gets written into meeting minutes. She didn't move. Her arms remained folded. Her gaze stayed forward. No flinch, no breath caught in her chest, no visible reaction at all. To them, that confirmed everything. Ignorance, confusion, irrelevance. The man in the gray suit reached for the thick contract folder near the center of the table, the one everyone else had been orbiting all morning. $800 million, bound in paper and confidence. We'll discuss final terms among ourselves, he said in English now, voice smooth. She doesn't need to be involved in this part. No one objected. Not the junior executives lining the wall. Not the legal counsel pretending to review notes. Not the interpreter who suddenly found something fascinating on his tablet. The room agreed to erase her without saying it out loud. She watched it happen. She had seen this look before, years ago, in rooms much smaller than this one. Rooms where people assumed her silence meant she didn't belong. Where they spoke freely, carelessly, cruelly because they thought language was a shield. They were wrong then. They were wrong now. Her eyes shifted, just slightly, following the contract as it slid away from her reach. The movement was small enough that no one noticed, except the camera in her mind, recording everything, every word, every smirk, every mistake, because this room wasn't quiet. It was charged. And before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. She exhaled slowly through her nose, steadying herself not in pain, but in control. They still didn't know who she was. They still thought the language they used made them untouchable. Across the table, the man who had spoken first leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He glanced at her one more time, dismissive, and added one final line in Mandarin, softer this time. She should be grateful just to be in the room. The words landed, and this time, something changed. Her jaw tightened not with anger, but with precision. She understood every single word, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she uncrossed her arms, slowly, deliberately, as if preparing to speak. Not yet, but soon. They hadn't invited her by name. That was the first thing they got wrong. On the official agenda, she was listed as a representative. No title, no biography, just a single line buried between logistics and lunch arrangements. To the men seated around the table, that omission said everything they needed it to say. She was an accessory, a formality, Someone brought along so the meeting could claim balance. She took her seat without asking where she belonged. Second, from the end. Not the head, not the center. Close enough to observe, far enough to be dismissed. The kind of placement that looks accidental, but never is. As she sat, a few eyes flicked up, quick scans, unconscious audits, navy suit, clean tailoring, natural hair pulled back, neat but unadorned, no diamonds, no designer logos screaming status. No visible markers they had been trained to respect. One executive leaned back and whispered to another, this time in English, she must be with compliance. Another assumed, translator maybe. Someone else didn't bother guessing at all. They talked over her like she was furniture. When the lead negotiator began outlining projections, he spoke directly to the men across from him, hands moving confidently over charts and numbers. Every so often, his gaze skipped past her as if there were empty air where she sat. She didn't interrupt. She didn't clear her throat. She listened. She listened the way people do when they already know the ending. Inside, she cataloged everything. The inflated confidence, the rehearsed charm, the way certain figures were emphasized while others were quietly skipped. She noted who deferred to whom, who waited to laugh until the most powerful man did, who avoided eye contact when ethics brushed too close to profit. Power, she knew, always leaves fingerprints. At one point, a junior executive slid a document down the table. It stopped just short of her hand, not handed to her, near her, close enough to pretend it was shared. She didn't reach for it. She had already memorized the numbers weeks ago. Across the room, the interpreter shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at her once, then away. He had been briefed, too, told she wouldn't need translation, told she wasn't the decision-maker. He believed them. She could tell by the way his shoulders relaxed when Mandarin filled the room again by how free the conversation became when they thought they were insulated by language. This wasn't her first time being underestimated. Years ago, in a different city, she had been invited into rooms like this as an observer, always close enough to learn, never close enough to matter. She learned quickly that silence made people careless, that arrogance loosened tongues, that the moment someone decides you don't belong, they reveal exactly who they are. So she stayed quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because every second they ignored her, they exposed themselves. The men laughed again at something said off record. One of them gestured vaguely in her direction and waved it off, as if brushing away an inconvenience. "We'll finalize without distractions," he said, smiling. She met his eyes for the briefest moment. There was no challenge in her expression, no plea, just calm, focused, almost curious. He looked away first. To the room she was still invisible, still mislabeled, still filed under non-essential. They didn't know she had flown in alone that morning, not to observe, but to decide. They didn't know the funding trail led back to her signature. They didn't know the deal in front of them existed only because she had allowed it to. And they definitely didn't know that every word spoken in Mandarin had been understood, translated, and stored with surgical clarity. The meeting pressed on, confidence swelling on one side of the table, control quietly settling on the other. She adjusted her posture, resting her hands flat against the polished wood. Grounded. Present. Still silent. Still waiting. Because the longer they mistook her quiet for weakness, the harder the truth would land when she finally spoke. The longer the meeting went on, the bolder they became. It always happened this way. At first, the exclusion was subtle glances that skipped over her, questions directed only to the men she sat beside. But as minutes passed and nothing challenged their assumptions, restraint dissolved into comfort. Comfort turned into carelessness. Mandarin took over the room again. Not for clarity, for cover. One of the executives leaned forward, tapping a chart with his pen. "The valuation only works if we move fast," he said in English, then switched languages mid-sentence without hesitation. His tone shifted with it looser, sharper. "She doesn't need to hear this part," he added in Mandarin, eyes flicking briefly in her direction. "It's too complex." A few men chuckled. She kept her gaze on the table, tracing the faint grain in the wood with her eyes, as if she were bored, as if she were lost, as if she weren't following every single word. Another executive joined in, louder now. "Why is she even here?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice this time. We're wasting time explaining things to people who won't decide anything. No one corrected him. The interpreter shifted again, visibly uneasy now. He opened his mouth once, as if to say something, then thought better of it. He wasn't paid to interrupt power. He was paid to serve it. The contract folder moved again. This time, deliberately. The man at the head of the table pulled it closer to himself, angling it away from her line of sight. His body language was casual, almost lazy, but the message was precise. This is no longer your conversation. We'll finalize internally, he said in English, smiling like a host reassuring a guest. Then we'll inform all relevant parties. Hellevant. The word hung in the air. She noticed how no one looked at her when it was said. A junior associate cleared his throat. Shouldn't we confirm alignment with Day? The older executive cut him off with a raised finger. Later, the associate nodded immediately, shrinking back into silence. Lesson learned. Hierarchy reinforced. On the far side of the table, someone muttered another comment in Mandarin. This one wasn't even strategic. It was indulgent. At least she's dressed professionally, the man said. Better than the last one they sent. More laughter. She felt it then, not anger, not shock, but something colder. The precise moment when disrespect stopped being incidental and became intentional. When they weren't just excluding her, but enjoying it. She adjusted her chair slightly, the soft scrape of metal against wood barely audible. Still, no one looked at her. They were too busy talking over her, around her, past her, discussing timelines, contingencies, exit clauses, using her presence as proof of inclusion while ensuring she had none. The lead negotiator leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. Relaxed, confident, dangerous. We'll need final approval by end of day, he said. If not, we walk. He said it like a threat. He said it like he held the leverage. Her eyes lifted then just enough to meet his face. He didn't notice. He was already looking at someone else, already convinced of his position. If he had looked closer, he might have seen it. The calculation behind her calm. The patience sharpened by years of being underestimated. The certainty settling in her chest. Because what he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that the deal didn't move unless she allowed it to move. And every dismissive word they spoke, every joke they made in a language they assumed she didn't understand, was quietly tightening the consequences waiting for them. The disrespect had escalated. The balance had already shifted. They just didn't feel it yet. She had learned a long time ago that silence made people reckless. In rooms like this, people mistook quiet for confusion, stillness for submission. They assumed that if you didn't interrupt them, you didn't understand them, that if you didn't fight for space, you didn't deserve it. She let them believe it. As the conversation continued, she leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes steady, posture composed. To anyone watching, she looked detached, almost passive, like someone waiting for instructions that would never come. But inside, her mind was working with ruthless clarity. Every sentence spoken in Mandarin landed cleanly. No gaps, no guessing. Not just the words, but the intent behind them. The hierarchy, the contempt wrapped in humor, the casual certainty that she was beneath notice. She had heard these tones before. Years ago, in her 20s, sitting in the back of conference rooms as consultants spoke over her head. They switched languages then too, French, German, Mandarin, not because it was necessary, but because it was convenient, because exclusion was easier when it sounded sophisticated. That was when she decided to learn. Not conversational phrases, not polite greetings, fluent, precise, boardroom-level fluency. She remembered the nights spent repeating tones until her throat ached, the mornings listening to financial briefings in Mandarin while others slept. She remembered being told it was unnecessary, overkill, a distraction. Why would you need that? Someone had once asked her. She hadn't answered. Now, years later, that question echoed faintly as the men across the table spoke freely, unaware that every insult was being translated in real time without effort, without strain. She caught the smallest details. The way one executive deferred before speaking, always waiting for the older man's approval. The way another exaggerated confidence to mask uncertainty. The way the deal's weak points were discussed only in Mandarin, as if language itself could hide structural flaws. They were revealing more than they realized. She glanced at the contract again, not to read it, but to confirm what she already knew. The margins, the clauses, the leverage points buried beneath legal language. She knew exactly where the deal bent. She also knew where it broke. A faint memory surfaced standing outside a glass-walled office years ago, watching a meeting she wasn't invited into, hearing laughter through the door, knowing decisions about her work were being made without her in the room. Back then, she had knocked. Today, she didn't need to. Across the table, someone said something sharp in Mandarin. A line meant to amuse. The others smiled. One of them shook his head like this was all predictable. She felt the smallest shift in her chest. Not hurt. Resolve. They thought understanding required permission. That access was something they could grant or deny. They had built an entire sense of superiority around that belief. They had no idea how fragile it was. Her fingers rested flat against the table now, palms grounded against the polished wood. The surface was cool, solid, real, a reminder that she was exactly where she needed to be. She wasn't waiting for an opening. She was waiting for completion. For them to finish exposing themselves. For arrogance to do its work. For the moment when their confidence peaked just high enough to make the fall undeniable. The room buzzed with conversation, numbers flying back and forth, certainty thick in the air. They thought the power was on their side. She understood something they didn't. Power doesn't announce itself. It listens. It waits. And when it moves, it doesn't ask for permission. She lifted her eyes again, scanning the faces around the table not with curiosity, but with assessment, measuring how each of them would react when the truth finally broke the surface. Some would panic. Some would pretend not to understand. One or two would try to recover with apologies that came too late. She already knew which was which. Her silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. And soon they would understand exactly what it meant. It happened without ceremony. No raised voice. No slammed hand. Just one sentence, casual, effortless, cruel. The oldest man at the table leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded with satisfaction. He glanced toward her for the first time in nearly an hour, then spoke in Mandarin as if commenting on the weather. "She should be pouring tea," he said. "Not sitting here." The words landed softly. That was what made them dangerous. A ripple of laughter followed, not loud, not vulgar, refined, controlled. The kind of laughter that believed itself untouchable. The kind that assumed agreement from everyone in the room. No one corrected him. No one objected. Not even the ones who knew it had gone too far. The interpreter froze, just for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked toward her, then back to the table. He swallowed, said nothing. He had crossed the point of discomfort into self-preservation. The contract lay open now, pages spread, figures exposed. $800 million reduced to ink and arrogance. One of the executives tapped the paper lightly with his pen, still smiling. "She doesn't need to stay," another added, again in Mandarin. "This part requires real authority." Authority. That word again. Her breath slowed. In her chest, something settled, not rage, not humiliation, but clarity. The moment when patience stops being a strategy and becomes a decision. She lowered her gaze to the table, not in submission, in focus. The room kept moving around her, unaware that it had reached the edge. Voices overlapped. Numbers were repeated. Someone joked about closing early and celebrating later. They thought the meeting was nearing its end. They didn't realize it was about to restart. A memory cut through her calm like a blade. Years ago. Another boardroom. Different country. Same tone. She had been told to observe quietly while decisions about her own division were made. Someone had laughed then, too. Said she was too polished to be dangerous. She remembered sitting still, listening, learning. She remembered promising herself that one day, silence would be a choice, not a cage. Back in the present, the laughter faded. The man who had spoken leaned forward again, satisfied with himself, ready to move on. That was when the room changed. She lifted her head. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough. The movement was subtle, but it pulled the air with it. Like the first shift before an earthquake, conversations slowed. One voice trailed off mid-sentence. Her chair didn't scrape. Her hands didn't shake. She simply placed her palms flat on the table. The polished wood felt cool beneath her skin. She didn't look angry. She looked precise. The men across from her were still smiling, still relaxed, still unaware that the line they had just crossed wasn't social, it was structural. That sentence wasn't just an insult. It was proof. Proof of how they saw her. Proof of how they spoke when they believed power protected them. Proof that the deal in front of them was built on assumptions she could no longer ignore. For 2 full seconds, no one spoke. Then someone cleared his throat, uneasy. Another adjusted his tie. The interpreter shifted in his seat again, this time unable to hide the tension in his shoulders. They felt it now. Not understanding yet, but pressure. She inhaled once, slow, controlled. When she exhaled, her voice didn't rise. She hadn't spoken yet, but everyone in the room knew, without knowing why, that something irreversible had just been set in motion. They had crossed the line, and the cost of that mistake was about to become very, very clear. Her voice entered the room without asking. Not loud, not sharp, perfectly placed. She spoke in Mandarin. Clear, unaccented, controlled. Say it again. The sentence was simple, calm, almost polite, but it cut straight through the room like a blade. Every movement stopped. The man who had laughed a moment earlier froze mid-shift in his chair. His smile collapsed not all at once, but unevenly, like it was unsure where to go. He blinked. Once, then again, as if replaying what he had just heard. She continued, still in Mandarin. Repeat what you said, she added. This time, don't whisper. Silence slammed down on the table. The interpreter's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered softly against the wood. No one looked at him. No one needed to. The truth had already landed, heavy and undeniable. She understood them. Not partially. Not enough to get by. Fully. The older executive straightened, suddenly alert. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face as if looking for cracks in accent, a hesitation, anything that might prove this was a trick. There was nothing. She met his gaze steadily, unblinking. You said I should be pouring tea, she went on, still in Mandarin. Her tone didn't accuse. It quoted, You said I don't belong at this table. The words, once so casually thrown, now sounded different in the open air. Smaller, exposed. A junior executive shifted uncomfortably. Another reached for his glass of water, then thought better of it. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier drained fast, leaving something raw behind. That's not what we meant. One of them began in English this time, too quickly. She didn't switch languages. You also said, she continued, that I wouldn't understand, that I was a distraction, that this deal should be discussed without me. Her eyes moved from face to face as she spoke, precise and unhurried, like a surgeon naming each incision. The man who had first insulted her opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind raced ahead of his words, finally catching up to the consequences. She paused, not for effect, for accuracy. Then she leaned forward slightly, palms still on the table, and spoke the line that shifted everything. In case there's still confusion, she said, now switching smoothly into English, let me clarify something. Every eye locked onto her. I'm not here to observe, she continued. I'm not here to translate, and I'm definitely not here to serve tea. For my toes, her gaze settled on the contract between them. I'm here because every dollar in that deal moves with my approval. 2. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Someone whispered her name, finally recognizing it. Someone else reached instinctively for their phone, then stopped, realizing how futile that would be. The man at the head of the table stiffened. There must be some misunderstanding, he said carefully. She tilted her head slightly. No, she replied. The misunderstanding was yours. She straightened fully now, presence filling the room in a way it hadn't before, not because she raised her voice, but because she no longer allowed herself to be ignored. You mistook silence for ignorance, she said. You mistook language for protection, and you mistook me for someone without authority. She closed the folder gently, not angrily. Final. That ends now. No one interrupted. No one laughed. The power in the room had shifted not explosively, but completely, like gravity reversing direction. Moments ago, they had been deciding whether to walk away from the deal. Now they were realizing they had never been the ones holding the door. She stepped back from the table, calm as ever. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one spoke over her. They were too busy understanding what it meant when the wrong person had been underestimated and the right person had finally decided to speak. The silence didn't break. It hardened. You could feel it settle into the walls, into the polished table, into the men who had spent the last hour certain of their position. No one moved. No one reached for a pen. Even the air conditioning seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was listening. She remained standing, not looming, not posturing. Simply present undeniable now in a way she hadn't been before. The older executive tried to recover first. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We didn't realize," he said carefully. "There's been a misunderstanding." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke again in Mandarin. "You didn't misunderstand," she said evenly. "You assumed." The word landed with precision. "You assumed I was invisible," she continued. "You assumed language gave you cover. You assumed this table belonged to you." Her pronunciation was flawless, not academic, not rehearsed. It was the language of someone who had lived inside it long enough to understand not just words, but power. She turned slightly, addressing the man who had spoken first. "You said I was a servant," she reminded him. "You said I should pour tea. You said I wouldn't understand." His face drained of color. "You used the word foyun," she added, almost gently. "But the way you used it wasn't neutral. It was contempt." A few heads snapped toward him. The room shifted again, not just in power, but in alignment. They were recalculating now, scrambling to distance themselves from the mistake that had a name and a face. She switched back to English without pause. "For clarity," she said, "I learned Mandarin because I got tired of being discussed as if I weren't in the room." She reached into her bag and placed a single card on the table. Matte black. No logo, just a name and a title embossed in silver. CEO. Several men leaned forward instinctively. She didn't push the card toward them. She didn't need to. "You've spent the last hour debating whether this deal works for you," she went on. "What you failed to realize is that it already passed every internal review on my side." A quiet murmur spread. "The funding," she said, tapping the contract once with her finger, "routes through my firm. The risk exposure you're so confident about mitigating, that's underwritten by my board." She looked directly at the man at the head of the table. "And I am the board." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Someone exhaled sharply. Another man leaned back, as if distance might help. The interpreter stared straight ahead, hands clenched, wishing himself smaller. The older executive cleared his throat. "If we've caused offense," she raised a hand. Not aggressively, decisively. "This isn't about offense," she said. "It's about information." She let that settle before continuing. "You were honest today," she said. "More honest than you intended. You showed me exactly how you operate when you think power is on your side." She picked up the contract, weighing it in her hand. "That honesty matters," she added, "because now I know what kind of partners you would be." Her gaze swept the room one last time, not angry, not triumphant. Final. The reveal wasn't just who she was. It was what she now understood about them. And that understanding would decide everything that came next. No one argued. That was the first sign it was over. The men who had dominated the room only minutes earlier now sat frozen, eyes darting, minds racing. Confidence had drained from their posture, replaced by something raw and unpracticed. They were no longer negotiating. They were calculating damage. One of them leaned forward, voice careful, almost pleading. "Let's not be hasty," he said. "This partnership has potential. We can reset. Apologies can be made." She didn't answer right away. She placed the contract back on the table slowly, deliberately, then slid it toward the center, exactly where it had been at the start of the meeting. The symmetry was intentional. "Apologies don't reset character," she said calmly. "They just confirm it." The older executive swallowed hard. "We were speaking casually," he tried, privately. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. "You weren't private," she replied. "You were honest." The word landed harder than any accusation. Around the table, the room began to fracture. One executive shook his head, already rehearsing excuses. Another reached for his phone. then stopped, realizing there was no call that could undo what had happened. Someone else spoke up, desperate now. "If this is about respect," he said, "we can address that internally." She nodded once. "That's exactly what I'm doing," she said. She closed the folder. The sound was soft, final. "This deal," she continued, "was built on trust. On the assumption that when I wasn't speaking, I wasn't being erased." She pushed the contract back toward them, not offering it, but returning it. "I don't fund people who mistake dominance for leadership," she said. "And I don't partner with organizations that confuse silence with consent." The man at the head of the table stood abruptly. "You can't just walk away from $800 million, he snapped, panic bleeding through control. "There are consequences." She met his stare without blinking. "I'm aware," she said. "I've calculated them." She rose fully from her chair. The movement was unhurried, but it changed the room. Chairs scraped back as others stood instinctively, unsure whether to follow, unsure of the rules now that power had shifted. She gathered her bag, straightened the cuff of her sleeve, and looked around one final time. "You thought you were testing me today," she said quietly. "What you didn't realize is that I was evaluating you." She turned toward the door. Behind her, voices broke loose, overlapping, frantic. "Wait, we can adjust terms. This doesn't have to end like this. Whiz." She stopped. Not to negotiate. To finish it. She turned back just enough for them to see her face. "It already has," she said. She stepped out of the room. The door closed with a muted click. Inside, the collapse was immediate. Chairs fell back into place without purpose. Someone cursed under his breath. Another sank into his seat, staring at the contract like it had betrayed him. $800 million evaporated not with an explosion but with clarity. They hadn't lost a deal. They had lost credibility. And everyone in that room knew it. Because power doesn't need to threaten. It just leaves, and lets the consequences stay behind. The hallway outside the boardroom was quiet. Too quiet for what had just happened. Her heels echoed once against the marble floor, then again, steady and unhurried. No one followed her. No assistant rushed to catch up. No security stopped her to ask questions. The door behind her remained closed, sealing in the panic, the voices, the sudden understanding that power had shifted without permission. She welcomed the silence. This was the part people never saw. Not the confrontation. Not the reveal. Not the collapse. The aftermath where clarity replaces adrenaline. She paused by the window at the end of the corridor. Beyond the glass, the city stretched out in sharp lines and muted colors, indifferent to boardrooms and bruised egos. Deals were made and broken every day. Most of them loud, most of them forgettable. This one wouldn't be. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't answer it. She already knew what it would say. They're asking if there's a way back. They're offering revisions. They want to apologize properly this time. She slipped the phone back into her bag. Some apologies arrived too late to matter. Inside the boardroom, they would be dissecting the moment, replaying it frame by frame, arguing about where it went wrong, who said too much, who should have stopped it. They would blame language, culture, miscommunication. They would blame everything except the truth. The truth was simpler. They had revealed who they were when they believed no one who mattered was listening. She had listened, and she had decided. That decision wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't revenge. It was alignment. She had built her career on one rule: power without dignity is a liability. She had walked away from opportunities before quietly, without headlines when something felt off. Today wasn't different. It was just clearer. She straightened, rolling her shoulders back, and turned from the window. As she walked toward the elevator, a memory surfaced uninvited, but welcome. Her younger self, standing at the edge of a different room years ago, being spoken around instead of spoken to. The feeling of understanding more than people thought. The discipline it took not to react. To wait. To learn. To build. Back then, she had promised herself something. If she ever reached a position where her silence carried weight, she would never waste it. The elevator doors slid open. She stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. Calm, centered, unapologetic, not triumphant, but resolved. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a standard being set. The elevator descended smoothly, floor by floor, leaving the boardroom behind. Somewhere above her, men who had once felt untouchable were now learning the cost of assumption. By the time she reached the lobby, the phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. "Yes," she said simply. A pause. "Then no," she continued. "We're not revisiting it." Another pause. Longer. "I'm aware of the implications," she added. "That's why the decision stands." Captor. She ended the call and stepped out into the open space of the building's entrance. Light poured in from the glass facade. People moved past her without knowing what had just happened upstairs. To them, she was just another executive heading to her next meeting. She liked that. Outside, a car waited at the curb. She slid into the back seat and closed the door softly. As the city began to move around her again, she allowed herself one final thought, not bitter, not angry, just clear. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought language meant power. They thought respect was something they could ration. They were wrong. Silence is not ignorance. Language is not a shield. And respect is not optional when the power in the room belongs to someone you underestimated. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't slammed the table. She had simply withdrawn her authority. And that, she knew, was the loudest statement of all.